In a courtroom thick with tension, Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary, stands defiant against a judge who seeks to strip her of her faith, her silver cross, a symbol of belief and resilience. What begins as a routine observation of a religious case turns into a national spectacle, igniting a firestorm of controversy, power struggles, and an unrelenting fight for religious freedom. As she stares down the gavel of a man determined to silence her, Karoline's resolve hardens. This isn't just about her anymore, it's about a nation's right to worship freely. Karoline Leavitt walked into the courtroom with the kind of poise expected from someone who had spent years weathering relentless media storms. At just 29, she had already learned that standing at the crossroads of power meant facing relentless scrutiny. But nothing in her tenure at the White House could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. She had come to observe, nothing more. President Trump had personally requested she sit in on the case, an intense legal battle in which a group of Christian plaintiffs fought for their right to public prayer. The case had gained traction over the past few months, fueled by an ever-deepening divide over religious freedoms in America. The plaintiffs argued that their constitutional rights were being stripped away under the guise of neutrality, while the opposing side claimed that open displays of faith in public institutions undermined the separation of church and state. But from the moment she entered the courtroom, Karoline sensed something was off. Judge Charles Hargrove, a man with an ironclad reputation for pushing the boundaries of judicial authority, barely spared her a glance. His rulings in similar cases had revealed a distinct pattern, one that skewed against religious expression, particularly Christianity. The legal team inside the White House had warned her about him, but she had assumed the fight would play out between the lawyers. She never expected to be pulled into it herself. The turning point came before the case had even begun. As Karoline took her seat behind the defense team, a bailiff approached her with a hushed urgency. There was a request, no, a demand, that she remove the silver cross hanging from her neck. She glanced toward the judge's bench, her pulse steady but her mind racing. Hargrove was watching her now, eyes sharp with something that looked more like a challenge than a command. He hadn't objected to the lawyers wearing flag pins or the reporters with their microphones bearing network insignias. No, this was different. This was personal. The weight of the courtroom bore down on her. The silent attention of the press already stirring in anticipation. The refusal was instant, though calm, as she folded her hands in her lap. If the judge wanted a confrontation, he would have to be the one to take it further. And he did. Within moments, Hargrove's gavel cracked through the air, and his voice carried with it an authority meant to crush dissent. He labeled her cross an overt religious display and accused her of violating courtroom decorum. Then came the fine, a staggering, punitive amount meant to humiliate her into submission. The reaction was immediate. A ripple of shock passed through the room. The Christian plaintiffs exchanged tense glances, while the opposing counsel, clearly emboldened, smirked in satisfaction. Even the reporters, so often eager to criticize the administration, sat frozen, their pens hovering over their notepads. Karoline inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She was no stranger to controversy, but she had never expected to become part of the very case she had come to observe. Hargrove's ruling wasn't just a slight against her, it was a blatant overreach, an attempt to set a precedent that faith had no place in the halls of justice. The fine was meant to silence her. It did the opposite. With deliberate calm, she rose to her feet. Every movement was calculated, every expression measured. The press leaned in, their cameras flashing, waiting for the kind of confrontation that could ignite a media frenzy. And she would give it to them. What happened next was not a mere exchange of words. It was a battle of principles, a clash between power and conviction. As Karoline spoke, invoking the very Constitution the judge had sworn to uphold, the room shifted. Murmurs grew into quiet gasps as she laid out the hypocrisy of his decision. The First Amendment was not a privilege, it was a right. And she would not be the one to surrender it. Judge Hargrove's face darkened, his fingers tightening around the gavel. He had not anticipated resistance, certainly not from her. The courtroom, once under his complete control, now held a tension he could not contain. Karoline had not come here to fight. But now that the battle had found her, she would see it through. Outside the courtroom, news of the judge's actions spread like wildfire. The headlines captured the essence of the moment. Press secretary fined for wearing a cross, religious freedom under fire. Social media erupted, dividing the nation further, as protests began forming on both sides. But for Karoline, this was no longer just about the fine. She had been thrust into something much larger than herself, a fight not just for faith, but for the fundamental rights of every American. And if Judge Hargrove thought he had won, he was about to learn the true power of unwavering conviction. This was just the beginning. Karoline stood firm, her heart pounding in her chest, but her expression betrayed nothing. The weight of the moment settled around her like an iron vice, but she refused to flinch. Judge Hargrove's gavel had fallen, but the battle was far from over. A tense silence gripped the room, broken only by the furious scratching of pens and the rapid clicks of camera shutters. The judge's attempt to put her in her place had backfired, spectacularly. Instead of retreating, she had become the center of a brewing storm, one that threatened to shake the very foundations of the legal system. Hargrove's voice sliced through the thick air, his tone colder now, more clipped. "Miss Leavitt, I will not tolerate disruptions in my courtroom. Remove the cross, or I will hold you in contempt." Karoline lifted her chin, her blue eyes locked onto his. "With all due respect, Your Honor, you have no legal ground to demand that I remove a symbol of my faith." Her voice carried across the room with the precise control she had perfected at the White House podium. "There is no statute, no judicial precedent that justifies this order. This is not about decorum. It is about power, and I will not comply." The room seemed to shrink around them, the air crackling with unseen energy. A low murmur rippled through the gallery, whispers spreading like wildfire. Even the seasoned reporters looked up from their notes, eyes widening. This wasn't just defiance, this was war. Judge Hargrove's expression darkened, his grip tightened. On the gavel, his knuckles whitening. He had expected submission, not resistance. "Then you leave me no choice," he said sharply, his voice like the crack of ice. "Bailiff, detain Miss Leavitt for contempt of court." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The bailiff hesitated. He was a man accustomed to following orders, but this was unprecedented. He had arrested plenty of disruptive defendants before, but never a high-ranking government official, never someone who had merely stood their ground. Karoline exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, waiting to see if she would break. But she wouldn't. Two uniformed officers approached, moving cautiously, as if unsure whether they were about to make the biggest mistake of their careers. Across the aisle, one of the attorneys for the Christian plaintiffs sprang to his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. You cannot—" Hargrove slammed the gavel down with a thunderous crack. "One more word, Mr. Donovan, and you'll be joining her." The attorney's mouth tightened, his jaw flexing with restrained fury, but he sat down, fists clenched. The courtroom doors burst open just as the bailiffs reached Karoline. A flurry of motion, Secret Service agents, led by a tall, sharp-eyed officer in a dark suit, stormed inside. The lead agent, a man Karoline recognized as Special Agent Kyle Jensen, took 2 steps forward, his presence enough to make the bailiffs halt in their tracks. "Step away from Miss Leavitt," Jensen ordered, his voice level but laced with quiet. "Authority?" "She is under federal protection." Hargrove's face twisted in fury. "This is my courtroom, and she is in violation of my order. I will not have my authority challenged." Jensen didn't so much as blink. "With all due respect, Judge, you have no legal authority to demand that a member of the executive branch remove a religious symbol, nor do you have the right to order her arrest without due process. If you attempt to detain her, you will be in direct violation of federal law." The tension was suffocating now. Hargrove's face burned red with rage, but even he knew he was treading on dangerous ground. "You're making a mockery of my courtroom," he seethed. Karoline tilted her head slightly, her lips curling in the faintest hint of a smile. "No, Judge, you did that the moment you tried to strip me of my rights." A beat of silence. Then, without another word, Hargrove slammed his gavel down. "This court is in recess," he snapped before storming off. The bench, his robe, billowing behind him. The moment he disappeared behind the judge's chamber doors, the tension broke. The room exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed toward the doors, phones ringing, cameras flashing, the media feeding frenzy already in full swing. Karoline turned to Jensen. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded. "You just made yourself the biggest headline in the country," she let out a breath. "I know." As they exited the courthouse, the roar of protesters filled the air. Outside, the battle had already begun. Protesters flooded the steps, some hoisting signs emblazoned with "Defend Religious Freedom" and "Stand with Karoline," while others jeered, waving placards that read, "Separation of Church and State and No Religion in Government." The scene was electric, a volatile clash of ideals unfolding in real time. Karoline barely had a moment to process it before microphones were shoved toward her, reporters shouting over each other. "Miss Leavitt, will you be appealing the fine? Do you believe the judge violated your rights? Are you concerned this could impact the administration?" Karoline held up a hand and the crowd hushed. When she spoke, her voice was clear, unwavering. "What happened today was not just about me. It was about every American's right to express their faith without fear of punishment. This is not a partisan issue. This is not about left or right. This is about the fundamental freedoms upon which this country was built, and I will not be silenced." The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion in her expression. The reporters knew a defining moment when they saw one, and this was it. Karoline stepped back, her mind already racing ahead. The battle lines had been drawn. Judge Hargrove had sought to humiliate her, to make an example out of her. Instead, he had ignited something far bigger than either of them. This fight was no longer confined to a courtroom. It was about to spill onto the national stage, into the halls of Congress, into the streets of every major city in America. And Karoline Leavitt was ready. This was war. As the White House motorcade cut through the streets of Washington, D.C., Karoline sat in the back seat of the black SUV, her phone lighting up with a relentless stream of notifications. The world was reacting explosively. The video of her standoff with Judge Hargrove had gone viral. Every major news network was running it on repeat, breaking down every second, every expression. Conservative outlets hailed her as a defender of faith, a warrior for the First Amendment. Left-leaning networks painted her as a reckless agitator, exploiting a courtroom incident to inflame cultural tensions. The divide was deepening, and she was now at the center of it. She glanced out the window, the Washington Monument looming in. The distance, bathed in the soft glow of evening. Her mind was already moving 100 miles an hour. This wasn't just about a fine. This was a battle for the very soul of the country. Her phone rang. She recognized the number immediately. "Mr. President," she answered, keeping her voice steady. Trump's unmistakable voice came through, brimming with energy. "Karoline, you did good. You did damn good." "I appreciate that, sir," she replied, "but this is far from over." "You're right about that," he said. "Hargrove overplayed his hand, and now the whole country is watching. We're not letting this slide. I want a press conference first thing in the morning. You're leading it." Karoline expected as much. "I'll be ready." "I know you will. And Karoline," Trump's voice took on a sharper edge, "they're going to come after you. Hard. The left, the media, even some of our own. Don't flinch," she smiled slightly. I never do." The call ended and she leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. She had spent years in the trenches of political warfare, but this was different. This wasn't just about messaging or optics. This was personal. As the SUV pulled into the White House grounds, Karoline was already formulating her next move. The next morning, the briefing room was packed. Journalists filled every seat, cameras trained on the podium. Outside, the protests had only grown, both sides doubling down, the noise bleeding into the White House itself. She stepped up to the podium, her silver cross glinting under the lights. She saw the way the reporters' eyes flicked to it, the way they leaned forward, eager for the battle about to unfold. Karoline leveled them with a cool, steady gaze. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I will start with this. The First Amendment is not up for negotiation." A flurry of murmurs swept through the room. Hands shot up, but she wasn't done. What happened yesterday was a violation of fundamental rights. A sitting judge attempted to strip an American citizen, myself, of the ability to wear a religious symbol in a public courtroom. This was not a matter of decorum. It was a direct attack on religious expression, and if this administration stands for anything, it stands for the right of every American to practice their faith freely. A reporter from the Washington Post cut in. "Miss Leavitt, some legal analysts argue that Judge Hargrove was simply enforcing neutrality in the courtroom, that religious symbols of any kind can be deemed inappropriate in a legal setting. How do you respond to that?" Karoline arched a brow. "Then why weren't American flag pins removed? Why were journalists allowed to keep their network logos visible? Why was I specifically targeted? This was not about neutrality. This was about control." Another reporter from CNN jumped in. "Critics say you are turning this into a political spectacle to galvanize the religious right. Are you planning to use this incident to further a political agenda?" She didn't even blink. "The only agenda here is the defense of constitutional rights. If standing up for religious freedom is now considered political, then that speaks volumes about the state of our nation." The room buzzed with energy, the reporters sensing that this was no ordinary press briefing. This was a rallying cry. And then came the question she had been expecting. A reporter from MSNBC leaned forward, voice sharp. "Miss Leavitt, Judge Hargrove has just filed a formal complaint against you, claiming that your refusal to comply with court decorum was, quote, a deliberate act of defiance meant to undermine judicial authority. He is calling for a review of your actions by the D.C. Bar Association. Your response?" Karoline's fingers tightened slightly on the podium, but her face remained smooth. "Let me be perfectly clear," she said, her voice unwavering. "This is retaliation, pure and simple. A desperate attempt by a judge who was caught violating the very principles he swore to uphold, and I will not be intimidated." The room erupted. More questions, more voices clashing, shouting over one another, but she had said what she needed to say. She turned on her heel and walked out. Behind her, the battle raged on. Hours later, as she sat in the Oval Office with the president's senior advisors, the real fight was being mapped out. The administration was preparing to take this fight to Congress, using the incident to push for stronger protections for religious freedom. Conservative lawmakers were already drafting resolutions condemning Judge Hargrove's actions. The Supreme Court might even get involved if the case escalated further, and it would escalate. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "You don't know what you've started. Walk away before it's too late." She stared at the message, her jaw tightening. Threats were nothing new. She had been in politics long enough to expect them, but this one felt different. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. She locked her phone and looked out over the city, the protests still raging in the distance. She had thrown the first punch. Now she had to be ready for the counterattack, and Karoline Leavitt never backed down. The text message sat on her phone like a loaded gun, its implications pressing against her chest with an intensity she refused to acknowledge. She had faced threats before: hate mail, online harassment, the occasional veiled warning from political enemies. But this felt different. This wasn't just an angry critic on social media. This was calculated. This was personal. She turned the screen off and slid the phone into her pocket, refusing to let it shake her. If someone thought intimidation would force her to retreat, they were sorely mistaken. Outside the White House, the protests had only grown more chaotic. A line of police officers in riot gear separated the warring factions. Chants of "Defend Religious," "Freedom," clashed with "Keep religion out of government," each side growing more emboldened as the hours passed. Inside the Oval Office, tension was just as thick. "We have a situation," Chief of Staff Daniel Harrington announced, placing a thick file on the resolute desk. "Hargrove isn't backing down. He's calling for a judicial ethics review against you, Karoline. He's framing this as an attack on the judiciary, claiming you and the administration are attempting to undermine the independence of the courts." Karoline exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Of course he is. He overplayed his hand, and now he's trying to make himself the victim." National Security Advisor Robert Ellis leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "That's not the worst of it. We've received credible intelligence that activist groups, both far-right and far-left, are mobilizing. This is turning into a powder keg." Karoline folded her arms. "Let them mobilize. This fight isn't just mine anymore." Trump seated him behind the desk, steepled his fingers, and studied her. "Karoline, I know you're ready for this fight, but we need to be smart. If this escalates any further, we could be looking at riots in major cities. Congress is already circling like vultures. We have allies in the Senate drafting resolutions against Hargrove, but the Democrats are moving just as fast to condemn us." "Then we get ahead of it," Karoline said, her voice steady. "We take this to the American people." She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, waiting for her to break, but she wouldn't. "We need to turn this into a referendum. On religious liberty," she continued. "Not just about me, not just about one judge. This is about a growing movement to erase faith from public life. If we can control the narrative, we win." Trump nodded slowly. "I like it." He turned to Harrington. "Set up an exclusive interview, prime time. I want the biggest audience possible." Harrington nodded. "I'll call Tucker Carlson." Karoline wasn't naive. She knew what was coming. The media would dig into every part of her life, twist every statement she had ever made. They would try to destroy her credibility, drag her through the mud. She welcomed the fight, but before she could— "Leave the room," a young aide rushed in, his face pale. "Miss Leavitt, we have a problem." She raised an eyebrow. "What kind of problem?" He hesitated before handing her another phone. A video was already playing. The screen showed a dark figure in a hoodie approaching a suburban home. Karoline's blood ran cold as she recognized the house. It was her parents' home in New Hampshire. The footage was grainy, taken from a security camera, but the message was clear. The figure spray-painted 3 chilling words across the front door in bold red letters: "Silence her now." Her mother's trembling voice came through on speakerphone. "Karoline, what is happening? The police just left, but they said this." "Might be political." Karoline closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. She had expected attacks on her reputation, on her career. But this was something else entirely. "Mom, listen to me," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm sending security to you. Don't answer the door unless it's someone. You know, I'll handle this." Her mother hesitated. "Karoline, I'm worried about you." Karoline forced a reassuring tone into her voice. "I'm fine, Mom. I promise." She ended the call and turned back to the room, her hands clenched into fists. This just got personal. Jensen, her Secret Service lead, was already on the phone, barking orders. "We need full surveillance on the Leavitt residence. Increased detail around Miss Leavitt as well. If someone thinks they can intimidate her, they've got another thing coming." Trump's expression darkened. "This is crossing the line. We don't let this stand. We go on offense." Karoline straightened, a fire burning in her chest. "I want a full investigation. I want to know who's behind this, and I want to make it clear that this will not scare me into silence." Ellis leaned forward. Are you sure about that? This isn't just political anymore. This is real danger. She met his gaze without hesitation. I was never under any illusions that this fight would be easy, but I won't cower because some coward in a hoodie wants me to. If they think this will make me back down, they don't know me at all. That night, as she sat in her office, preparing for the interview, another text flashed across her phone. You should have listened. No name, no number. She stared at it for a long moment, then deleted the message without responding. Fear was a weapon, and she refused to let them wield it against her. Tomorrow night, the world would hear her side of the story, and whoever was trying to silence her, they were about to realize just how loud Karoline Leavitt could be. The hours leading up to the interview were a blur of preparations, security briefings, and relentless phone calls. The White House communications team was in overdrive, crafting responses, analyzing potential attacks from the media, and prepping Karoline for every possible question. Tucker Carlson might throw her way. Outside, the protests had reached a boiling point. The streets in front of the White House were lined with people, some holding candles in silent solidarity, others screaming for her resignation. The barricades were barely keeping the two sides apart. Karoline sat in the dimly lit makeup room at the Fox News studio, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was composed, but she could see the storm in her own eyes. She had spent years being the voice of an administration that thrived on confrontation. But this was different. This wasn't about spinning a narrative. This was about survival. Jensen stood by the door, his posture rigid. We've got eyes on every entrance. Nothing happens tonight, she nodded, appreciative of the reassurance, but she knew better than to rely on security alone. If someone wanted to get to her badly enough, they would find a way. A producer knocked on the upholstery. 2 minutes, Miss Leavitt. She took one last steadying breath before standing and adjusting the cross around her neck. It was time. The studio was bathed in cool blue lighting, the American flag glowing softly in the background. Tucker Carlson greeted her with a firm handshake before they both sat down across from each other. The cameras rolled. Good evening, Tucker began, turning toward the audience. Tonight, we bring you an exclusive interview with the woman at the center of the biggest political and cultural firestorm in the country, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt. Miss Leavitt, thank you for being here. She gave a small nod. Thank you for having me. Tucker leaned forward. Let's start with the question everyone is asking. You walked into a courtroom as an observer and left as the face of the biggest religious freedom battle in modern history. Did you ever expect this to happen? No, she admitted. I was there to observe a case on public prayer. I never thought I would become a case myself. But when Judge Hargrove ordered me to remove my cross, I had a choice. I could comply or I could stand for what I believe in. I chose to stand. Tucker's expression was unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes was clear. And since then, you've received threats. Your family has been targeted. Did you anticipate just how vicious the backlash would be? Karoline exhaled slowly. I knew it would be controversial, but I didn't expect the level of personal attacks we've seen. The fact that my parents' home was vandalized, that people are trying to intimidate me into silence, proves that this isn't just about me anymore. This is about a much larger effort to erase faith from public life. Tucker nodded, turning slightly toward the camera. The left is arguing that your defiance was an attack on judicial neutrality, that you intentionally disrupted the courtroom to push a political agenda. What do you say to them? Her expression didn't waver. I say that's nonsense. Judicial neutrality doesn't mean stripping people of their religious identity. If the judge had told a reporter to remove a press badge, if he had told an attorney to take off an American flag pin, this conversation wouldn't be happening. But because it was a Christian symbol, suddenly it's controversial. That's hypocrisy. Tucker leaned back slightly, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. And now, Judge Hargrove is calling for an ethics investigation into your actions. He's saying you disrespected the court, that you defied his authority. Caroline's hands curled into fists beneath the table, but she kept her voice calm. "Hargrove knows exactly what he did. He violated my constitutional rights and got caught. Now he's scrambling to flip the narrative to make himself the victim. But let me be clear, I will not be bullied and I will not apologize for standing up for my faith." The energy in the room shifted. Even the camera operators seemed to lean in closer, sensing that this wasn't just another interview. This was a moment. Tucker paused before his next question, his voice lowering. "Karoline, I need to ask you this. Given everything that's happened, the threats, the attacks, the national outrage, are you afraid?" She thought about the text messages, the vandalism, the growing sense that she was walking a dangerous line. Then she straightened her shoulders. "No," she said, "because fear is exactly what they want. The people behind these threats, the people pushing this agenda, they want me to back down. They want me to be afraid, but I refuse to be." The interview wrapped up minutes later, but the impact was immediate. Social media exploded. Conservative voices praised her defiance. Progressive commentators accused her of grandstanding. Political analysts dissected every word, every nuance, but the real consequences of her stance wouldn't be felt until the next morning. As Karoline sat in the back of the SUV heading toward the White House, Jensen's phone buzzed. He read the message, his jaw tightening. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated, then handed her the phone. Her stomach dropped. The text was accompanied by a photo. Her apartment, the windows shattered. Another message scrawled across the front door. "Final warning." Jensen was already on his phone. "We're moving you to a secure location. You're not going back there." Karoline clenched the phone in her hand, staring at the image. This wasn't political anymore. This was personal. She had expected the fight to be tough. She had prepared for the media backlash, the legal battles. But she hadn't expected this. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to silence her. They wanted to destroy her. And for the first time, she had to wonder, how far were they willing to go? The SUV sped through the streets of D.C., its tinted windows shielding her from the chaos outside. Karoline sat rigid in the back seat, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. The shattered windows, the threats, the escalation. It was a clear message. They weren't going to stop. Jensen's voice cut through the tense silence. "We're not taking any chances. You're being relocated to a secure government facility for the night." She shook her head. "No." Jensen turned in his seat. "No? Karoline, someone just vandalized your home. They're escalating. You need protection." "I need to show them that they can't push me into hiding." Her jaw clenched. "If I disappear, if I run, they win. They want me to be afraid, and I won't give them that satisfaction." Jensen exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Damn it, Karoline, this isn't about optics. It's about keeping you alive." She met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "Then do your job. Protect me. But I'm not running." Jensen cursed under his breath, but didn't argue further. He turned back, speaking into his earpiece. "Reroute. We're heading back to the White House." The moment they pulled through the gates, Karoline felt the shift in the atmosphere. There were more agents, more barriers, more tension in the air. The White House wasn't just her workplace anymore. It was a fortress. Inside, she found the West Wing buzzing like a beehive. Aides whispered in hurried tones. Staffers darted between offices with urgent expressions. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. Daniel Harrington was waiting for her in the Roosevelt room, his face tight with concern. "Karoline, I need you to hear me out." She crossed her arms. "If you're about to tell me to back down, don't bother." Harrington sighed. "Not back down. But we need to be strategic. This is turning into something bigger than we anticipated." He tossed a manila folder onto the table. "Our intel team has identified multiple extremist groups taking an interest in you, not just left-wing radicals, far-right groups too. Some see you as a symbol of resistance. Others see you as a political pawn." Karoline opened the folder. Surveillance photos, online chatter, flagged communications. It was worse than she thought. "They're planning something," Harrington continued. "We don't know what yet, but we can't ignore it." She closed the folder, exhaling slowly. So what's our move? Harrington exchanged a glance with Jensen. You need to lay low, just for a few days. Let the situation cool. No. Her voice was steel. We go on the offensive. Harrington raised an eyebrow. How? Karoline's mind was already moving. We make this bigger than me. We take this fight to Congress. We push legislation that strengthens protections for religious freedom in public spaces. We turn this into a movement. Harrington ran a hand through his graying hair. You're talking about a full-scale political war, she nodded. Exactly. Before he could argue, a communications aide rushed in, pale-faced. Karoline, you need to see this. She handed Karoline a tablet. A live news feed was playing, footage of a massive rally unfolding just blocks from the White House. Protesters filled the streets, their voices rising in a deafening roar. Some carried signs that read, "We stand with Karoline." Others held banners that screamed, "Keep religion out of government." The two sides were separated by a thin line of riot police, and then chaos. A loud bang echoed through the air, a flashbang, or something worse. The camera feed shook as people screamed. The police line broke, and the crowd surged forward. Fists flew, bottles were thrown. The peaceful protest had just turned into a full-blown riot. Karoline's stomach dropped. This is spiraling, Jensen muttered. Fast! Harrington turned to Karoline. Still think we go on the offensive? She swallowed hard, but her resolve didn't waver. More than ever. But before she could say anything else, a new notification flashed across the screen. Breaking! Judge Hargrove's home. Targeted in apparent retaliation. Attack. Karoline's breath hitched. She tapped the headline, pulling up the details. The judge's front door had been spray-painted, just like her parents' house. The words were different, but the message was the same. Justice will be served. It didn't matter that she had nothing to do with it. It didn't matter that she had never called for violence. The narrative was already being written. The screen cut to a live press conference. Judge Hargrove stood in front of the cameras, his face a mask of righteous indignation. This is what happens when we allow reckless rhetoric to take hold, he declared. This is what happens when public officials encourage defiance instead of respect for the law. I will not be intimidated, and I call on the White House to denounce this extremism immediately. The implication was clear. He was blaming her. The reporters were already running with it. The talking heads would dissect it all night. The administration would be forced to respond. Karoline set the tablet down, her mind racing. This was no longer just a fight for her rights. This was a fight for control of the narrative, and she was damn well going to win it. Karoline set the tablet down and exhaled slowly, her mind calculating her next move with surgical precision. Judge Hargrove had done exactly what she expected. Painted himself as the victim, twisting the attack on his home into an indictment of her. She could already see how the media would spin it. Karoline Leavitt's defiance sparks political violence. It didn't matter that she had never called for violence. It didn't matter that she had condemned every act of intimidation, including those against herself. The truth was irrelevant now. The perception was what mattered, and perception was a battlefield she knew well. Harrington pinched the bridge of his nose. We need to put out a statement immediately, distancing you from the attack. No, Karoline said, standing up. We need more than a statement. We need to reclaim the narrative before it's completely hijacked. Jensen folded his arms. Meaning what exactly? She turned to Harrington. Set up another press? Conference. Prime time in the White House briefing room. I'll make the statement myself. Harrington frowned. Are you sure? Anything you say will be scrutinized to hell and back? I want it scrutinized, she said. I want them to analyze every word because I'm not just going to condemn the attack. I'm going to expose the double standard. Jensen exchanged a look with Harrington, then exhaled. All right, let's do it. 2 hours later, the White House press briefing room was at capacity. Reporters packed every seat, their faces eager, expectant. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the chance to corner her, to force her into a defensive position. But Karoline Leavitt did not play defense. She stepped to the podium, hand steady, voice calm. The room fell silent, cameras zooming in. "I want to begin by addressing the attack on Judge Hargrove's home," she said. "Let me be unequivocally clear. I condemn all forms of political violence. No matter the target, no matter the motive, there is no justification for threats or intimidation." She let the words settle, making sure there was no room for misinterpretation. Then she pressed forward. "But I also want to ask a question, one that no one in this room seems willing to answer. Where was this outrage when my family's home was vandalized? Where were the calls for justice when I received threats? Where were the primetime headlines when my apartment was targeted with final warning spray-painted on my door?" The room shifted uncomfortably. Some reporters avoided her gaze. Others leaned forward, intrigued. "There is a dangerous game being played right now," she continued. "The same people who demand civility when it suits them are the first to look away when their opponents are the ones under attack. The truth is, political violence isn't just wrong when it happens to one side. It's wrong always." She saw the journalists scribbling furiously, knowing that her words were already making their way into headlines. "Judge Hargrove and I have fundamentally different views, and we are engaged in a legal and constitutional battle. But that is where the fight should stay, in the courtroom, in the public square, through debate, not destruction." She let the silence stretch for a beat before delivering the final blow. "But to those who think intimidation will silence me, those who think threats will force me to back down, you're wasting your time." Her blue eyes locked onto the cameras. "I am not afraid of you." The moment she stepped away from the podium, the room erupted with shouted questions. "Miss Leavitt, do you believe your rhetoric has fueled this conflict? Do you take any responsibility for the escalation? Are you suggesting Judge Hargrove staged the attack?" She didn't stop, didn't answer. She had said what she came to say, and the battle lines had been redrawn. Later that night, she sat in the Oval Office with Trump and his top advisors, watching the media reaction unfold in real time. Fox News hailed her as a fighter. Karoline Leavitt refuses to be bullied. Her defiant stand is a masterclass in leadership. CNN took the opposite angle. Leavitt dodges responsibility. Her reckless rhetoric continues to inflame tensions. MSNBC was even harsher. White House doubles down on defiance, refusing to take accountability for dangerous political climate. Trump smirked. "You rattled them." Karoline leaned back in her chair. "Good." Jensen's phone buzzed. He looked down, his expression tightening. "What now?" she asked. He handed her the phone. Another anonymous text. "You had your chance to walk away. Now, we make you pay." Karoline felt a cold rage settle in her chest. "They're desperate," she muttered. Trump's expression darkened. "Then we crush them." Jensen stood up. "I want every intelligence agency on this. Whoever's behind these threats, we find them. Now." Karoline stared at the phone for another moment before locking the screen. They thought they could break her. They were wrong. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Karoline set the phone down and exhaled, slow and measured. The threats had escalated, the stakes had risen, but her resolve remained unshaken. If anything, the past few days had only hardened her stance. Whoever was behind these attacks wanted her to retreat. They wanted her broken, afraid. But fear was a weapon she refused to surrender to. Jensen was already on the move, barking orders. Into his phone. "I want a full trace on that number. We need every available resource on this." He turned to Karoline. "This isn't just a political attack anymore. It's a coordinated operation." Harrington nodded, flipping through a new intelligence report. "We have chatter from multiple sources. Some of these threats are coming from extremist factions on both sides. It's no longer just about religious freedom. They see you as a symbol, and they want to destroy it." Karoline crossed her arms unfazed. "Then we beat them at their own game." Trump smirked. I like the way you think. Jensen, however, wasn't smiling. This isn't a game, Karoline. You're in real danger. We don't know who's pulling the strings yet, but whoever they are, they're connected, they're powerful, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to shut you up. Karoline met his gaze evenly. Then they're about to be very disappointed. By morning, the war had reached its climax. The FBI had traced the threats to a network of operatives, funded by dark money, linked to both radical groups and political elites who had no interest in allowing Karolines to emerge victorious. There were ties to left-wing activist organizations, to corrupt judges, even whispers of connections to certain high-ranking officials who saw her as a threat to their carefully constructed narrative. The attack on her apartment, the threats against her family, even the retaliatory strike on Judge Hargrove's home. It had all been orchestrated to manufacture chaos, to pit Americans against each other, and to force Karoline into a corner. But they had underestimated her. The evidence was damning, and it was about to go public. That evening, Karoline walked into the White House press briefing room for what would be the most important address of her career. The room was packed, the tension thick, the nation holding its breath. She stepped up to the podium and looked directly into the cameras. For the past several days, this country has been gripped by a battle over fundamental freedoms, she began. It started in a courtroom where a judge attempted to strip me of my right to wear a symbol of my faith. But it did not end there. A hush fell over the room. The reporters weren't just listening, they were hanging onto every word. The days that followed, my home was vandalized. My family was threatened. My name was dragged through the mud by those who wished to silence me. But today, the truth comes out. She gestured to the side of the room, where a large monitor flickered to life. Documents, photographs, messages, all. Evidence of the conspiracy that had been waged against her. The threats, the violence, the political theater. It was all orchestrated by powerful people who saw an opportunity to divide this nation, who believed they could weaponize fear to control the narrative. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters scrambled to take notes, their eyes wide with shock. This wasn't just a political scandal. This was something far deeper, far darker. Karoline took a deep breath. But they failed. Because America does not bow to intimidation. We do not surrender to those who seek to strip us of our rights. And we do not silence those who stand for what they believe in. She leaned forward slightly, her voice unwavering. I was never fighting just for myself. I was fighting for every American who has ever been told to sit down, to shut up, to hide their faith or their beliefs because it made someone else uncomfortable. That fight is over, and we won. The room exploded into chaos, reporters shouting, camera flashes blinding, the air thick with the weight of what had just been revealed. Karoline stepped back, her heart pounding, but her expression unshaken. She had done what she came to do. She had exposed the truth. She had reclaimed the narrative, and most importantly, she had won. Hours later, as she sat in the Oval Office, watching the news break in real time, she felt something she hadn't felt in days. Peace. Jensen stood beside, her arms crossed. It's over, Karoline nodded. For now. Trump chuckled from across the room. You just made history, Karoline. She smiled slightly. I didn't set out to. I just refused to lose. The country was still divided. There would still be battles ahead. But tonight, she had proven. That one voice, one person willing to stand firm, could shake the system to its core. She turned back to the window, watching as the city pulsed with life, knowing that tomorrow a new fight would begin. But she was ready. She had always been ready, and she would never back down.